Welcome to the Holistic Programmer for coding and health tips with your host, Brian Kidd.
Hello everyone, this is Brian Kidd, aka the Holistic Programmer. I want to do a video today about using an Express Proxy Server within Node in order to make API requests to the Yelp Fusion API. So before I get started, however, I want to give a shout out to Brad Traversy. Much of this tutorial was inspired by Brad Traversy from Traversy Media, who created a video for using a Node API proxy with the Open Weather API. So thanks, Brad, for helping me with my own problem, getting data from a server that does not allow CORS requests, even with the access control allow origin header. So in other words, Yelp servers for the Yelp Fusion API do not allow cross-origin resource sharing, or CORS. So what is CORS? Well, according to the Mozilla Developer Network, cross-origin resource sharing, or CORS, is an HTTP header-based mechanism that allows a server to indicate any origins, domain, scheme, or port other than its own from which a browser should permit loading resources. So even with the correct header, access allow control origin set to the server where the API request is coming from, CORS requests of any nature are not allowed for the Yelp Fusion API. So this is where I try to do this access control allow origin. However, it's not allowed. So I wasn't able to do this because you can't go from a client to the Yelp Fusion API server. However, you can use a proxy server, and we'll get to that. So it used to be that you could use Heroku CORS. And so that is, I believe, right here, the Heroku Anywhere. The CORS Anywhere Heroku CORS used to work, but unfortunately, you have to keep signing into it. So it really is, it's ideal for development mode, which I showed in a previous video, but it really isn't not ideal if you're using it in production for a live deployed application. So it used to be that you could use Heroku CORS Anywhere proxy, but you have to keep reconnecting to that proxy for it to work now, so that is not a viable option, as I mentioned. What is a viable option is using a Node proxy server with Express to act as an intermediary between the client and the server. This ensures that the client will call the proxy and then the proxy will call the API. Then you get the response. The response is the API will send the response to the proxy, which will send the data, in our case JSON data, back to the client. The browser is in charge of enforcing CORS headers, but if we bypass the browser, which we're doing, by using a proxy server as an intermediary, then CORS is not necessary, since the data request is coming from the proxy server and not the client. So we are going to use a proxy server so that we can store the Yelp Fusion API key on the server. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go to yelp.com/developers. So once you go there, click on Yelp Fusion API, and once you click on that, you can go to Manage API Access. You'll see your API, there'll be a link, I believe, to create a new app. I happen to already have an app that has my API key, so I don't really want to show it. But if you click there, it'll show your API key, which you'll need. And another option is to go here, and all the URLs that you'll need for this video are going to be in the description. And I'll give you directions on how to create a new app and then also get your API key. So once you got that, go to the repository. And in the repository, go ahead, you can clone it or download it, and then load it into your favorite text editor. I happen to be using Visual Studio Code. So now it's loaded. So once you do that, you'll notice that there's a package.json file. And in that package.json file, what we're going to do, just going to close all these, we don't need them, is we're going to see that these are all the dependencies that we're going to need. Actually, you don't need Axios. We're going to be using Needle. I tried to use Axios, and the Needle works. It just seemed to work a little bit better. But so you can delete that if you want, or install it and mess around with it if you want to. So once you get it loaded, you'll notice that you don't have an env file and you don't have the node modules. I happen to have those because I already loaded them in, but you won't have those two files, so you'll need those. You'll need the dependencies and the file, the env file. So what we're going to do first, is do the npm install. So we're going to do this. We're going to do an npm install and just push enter. And you might notice that there's some vulnerabilities. I didn't really have any issues. These are security vulnerabilities, I think. If you want to, you can go ahead and audit it. Do so at your own discretion. I haven't done that. I don't know if it'll break the app. You can do updates though, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot, so you should be okay. But please do that at your own discretion. Okay, the next thing is we have a .env file, and we want to make sure with that env file that we have our base URL, which in our case is going to be this URL here, which will be in the description, and then your API key. This isn't my full API key, so there's some off the screen there. So, but yeah, you want to use your API key. Now you can put quotation marks around these, and it seems to work either way. So that's your choice. I know that when you use Heroku, you don't want those. We'll get to that later, but you don't want to have quotation marks for the variables in Heroku, which you'll see during the deploy of this application. Okay, so now we have the env. We have the env file here, and we have all of our packages. So we want to continue on. So what we could do now is we can start looking. So I already installed. And we can start looking at the application itself. So let's start in the root directory where env file is. And let's make it smaller. So we'll show, right now you'll see we're using Express. So we know that we're going to need that, which we installed with npm install with all the other packages we'll need, all the other dependencies. And we have CORS, we need to use cross-origin resource sharing for this. And here is, this helps us use the env variables. We'll need that. And then this middleware, I'm not going to go into that. With this, it's basically just error handling middleware. You can check out that file if you want. And so then there's the rate limit. Now I'm not going to use rate limiting or catching in this video. That's for another video. So for the interest of time, I'm just going to get to the API calls. Okay, so here we have our port. So this will be the port that we're going to use. You want to see what port it's running on. It's either going to run on whatever we have in our environmental variables first, or on 5000, which is we're going to be running it locally in development on 5000. And so app is equal to our Express server. And I want to show you a test. So I'm going to change this in a second, but really quickly in Postman, just to make sure that you're able to make a request to get a response, right? What we're going to do is we're going to do an npm. We're going to do npm run dev. This will run the development server. Oh, so actually, there's something already running on 5000. But if you do a Control-C, if that ever happens to you, there's a way to go s of I, and then whatever server is running on, you can get the process ID, and you can do a kill, quit, and then you can do a 67454, because that's my process ID, right? And then you can go that, and that should open that, so you can use that local server. Okay, need this. Okay, so now that we've got the local server, it's not running yet, and I want to show you in Postman really quickly. If you put in localhost 5000/API, okay, and you try to do a request now. Hold on a sec, really quickly. 67454. No such process, so it shouldn't be. able to run this right now. So I'm not sure. Let's do this though. npm run that. This will run your local development server. Oh, so there is something running on. So this is interesting. Just want to make sure that's the issue. Yeah, so just do it again. So we'll just go back if you ever run into this issue. And then we'll 67575. All right. So there really shouldn't be anything running here. Okay, good. There's not. So you'll see that you're not making the request now because you need to run the development server, right? So we're going to do an npm run dev. I'll start the development server. Now we're going to make the call, the API call to Yelp Fusion API. We're going to see if it's actually making that call, right? And we get a 200, so it is. So that's a way to test it. What I'm going to do now, well, first, let me run through the rest of this. We're doing app, so we're using cores, and then this should load the index.html file. So that's using static, right, in our public folder. So that's this folder. So your index.html. And then, yeah, there's the air handler. And then this is where you get server running on port right there. That's this right here. So we make sure that our server is running essentially. Okay, but I'm gonna comment this out because now I'm gonna go into a new directory, right? And actually, what I want to make sure is that we're using this now. Is this gonna keep doing this? That would not be fun if it keeps saying that there's something in use. Let's want to make sure. I don't know why that's happening, but 67734. All right, so let's run it. And okay, hopefully that won't keep doing that. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna go into our routes folder. So here's routes. And this is where the magic essentially happens, I suppose. So you'll notice in here, in our routes folder, we have Express, we have the router, and now we're using that router now, whereas over here, before we were just using app.use, or app.get, sorry. Now this call is going to be directed into the routes directory. Now you don't even need to put index.js since that's automatic. Usually that's where it looks for. Looks for index files first, but I just happen to put that there. So it goes to the index.js file. And we're going to be using Needle. So Needle, it's just a very lightweight HTTP client. So basically the front end will make the request to our server and we will use Needle, which is a very lightweight HTTP client. Okay, so we're going to make it from the server. We're going to use Needle, and it's going to go from our server to make the request to the Yelp Fusion API. Okay, so after that, node index. So we'll go. Okay, so we'll show this right here. So Needle's being used for basically to make the request from our server, from our proxy server to the Yelp Fusion API. Okay, so we've got Needle. We've loaded that. Again, we're not going to do catching in this video. Okay, so we've got our router. Okay, so we're using that router. And that could be for another video about routers, but basically that's routing to this directory. It's coming from the index in the root directory to here. Okay, and so we're going to need these environmental variables, right? And so make sure you create these. And these just happen, they're in this env file here, right? And we're going to use them in order to make this request. Now, we're using a bearer token, and you can see there's a difference between, I don't know if I have it still up here. I don't think I do, but I can probably find it, but you probably remember in the beginning of the video that I showed how access control allow origin, I believe is what it's called, right? With the access control allow origin header, it doesn't work. But so I had to modify it to get it to work in this context. Okay, so we're using a try catch. Okay, and then we're basically gonna make sure we do an async await, of course, and we're using a get request, and then we have our base URL, right? So that's this, in our case, the Yelp Fusion URL, and our headers are simply the authorization and then the bearer token with the API key value. Okay, and then we get our data, right? So the data is going to be the body of that response coming back. And then we should get a status of 200 unless there's an error and the response doesn't work. Okay, pretty straightforward. But that is where this is essentially where the API request, it looks like it's coming from the proxy, right? And it's making the request from that to the server. Now, once that comes from the server to the proxy back to the client, this is where we get to the main, right? The main.js. So this is where we're going to display the response. So we set up our server, right? Okay. And now after that, we're going to go ahead and make our request from that proxy to the Yelp API. And then we're going to come in here and display the response. Okay, so once we display that response, the way we do that is, this should look familiar if you looked at my previous video where I did this in development mode. But essentially, we have our reviews, which is in the index.html, right? So this is a DOM element, and it's right somewhere. Oops, I did that in the wrong spot. Should be in here somewhere. Oops. Of course, it wouldn't be dot, it'd be class equals. Sorry about that. Or ID equals. Well, actually, that's not true. Class equals. So I was doing CSS and HTML there. But yeah, class equals the review. So this is where it's happening. This is where go up here, go to the main.js. So that's where this is all the display is right there. Okay, and that's where all this stuff's gonna be loaded into the DOM, appended to the DOM. So we have our get data. So this gets the data. This API is coming from the server side. It's not coming from the client side. So the API key is secure. Okay. So we have the URL here, and that's our API, right? /API. And then we're going to do an await. We have our async, and then await the fetch the URL. Okay. And again, I believe that URL is coming from the /API, right? So in other words, I believe it's all coming from this part. Okay, because originally, so it's coming from the server there, and it's saying, okay, so we want to get that from the routes here. We want to get that data, right? And we want to get the response and put it in JSON format. So now we have JSON data. So I guess essentially, if I wanted to show you this data, I can do that. And I think nodemon's going to be weird. I apologize for this. I don't know why this is happening. But I'm going to have to keep doing this. Don't worry, I don't think I have to do it more times. So let's get this. Hey, now you've learned a new thing, I guess, how to fill a process if you didn't already know that. Okay, so here's the console.log. Okay, And what I'll do is, it's running on localhost 5000, so let's run it. Okay, so it is running. Let's look at the data here in console. So here's your object, and here's your reviews. So here's the object when it comes in, and that's why I have to do .reviews, because it comes in essentially. Go back. This is how the data comes in, and then so we need to do like data.reviews essentially. And so that's where we do that here. We're gonna do the payload, and in the initial render, I'll show you how I did that. So here's the payload. So this is where it comes in. And we have get data, so we're calling this function here. And then we're going to say let the data set equal payload dot reviews. Okay, so we're going to pass that data set that I just showed you into these two functions. Okay, now by the way, it's data.reviews. That's what we're passing in. So we're passing in this right here, this data.reviews, that node right there, object node. Okay, so we're going to do the initial render. So in the initial render, right, we're passing the data set. And I did some destructuring here because before I did element.rating, element.text, but just to keep up with ECMAScript, right, 2015 or JavaScript 6, I believe it is, or something like that. With the advent of that, you're able to destructure. So it's kind of a slick way, instead of saying, before that we had element.rating. If instead of having to do that, you can just destructure off those different parts of the object. So the key values, so the different values. And you can just do rating text user equal element. Okay. And then I'm going to put those into the DOM using this inner HTML, display inner HTML. And here's the link. So that link is the element.url. So just to show all this, right? So you have the first, so there's the rating, the text, the URL. So that's the URL of the link of the actual review itself, since you only get a preview with Yelp. And so, let's see. So you have the user, the rating, and the text, right? So they'll show all those here. Here's the user. Now with the user, I did user.name, I believe, but since I destructured it, right? Yeah, I just did user.name since it's destructured. Okay, hopefully that's clear. So that's the initial render. And if you watched my previous video, you know that happens when it's loaded. So that's your initial render. Then after that, we have click-through events, right? And what's interesting about this is essentially the same thing, except for I'm not starting at 0. What I'm doing is I'm clicking through, right? I have a counter and it starts at 1. Now, the reason the counter starts at 1 is because we want the first click to go to the second one initially, or to 0, 1. We want it to start on 1 because this is 0 right here, right? If we clicked again, it would just show the same review. So we want to start at 1, 2, 0. 1, 2, 0. Now the way that it's able to go back to 0 is with this modulus. So the modulus operator ensures the counter starts over at 0. So 0, 1, 2, 0. Because once it gets to 3 here, well, modulus, this counter is going to be at 3, and then this is 3, right? 3 is the length of the array, right? Because that's how many previews you get. So it's 3 modulus 3 is 0. So it just keeps starting over. Okay. And then I call it, and that is what loads, once you call it, this is what loads it and displays it into the DOM. So if you have any questions about some of this code, you can look at the previous video where I did this in development mode. I didn't use a proxy server, but it explains this code pretty thoroughly because it's pretty much the same. The difference, of course, is this time we're using the Express server, right? And then we're directing that into routes, and we're making the API request from the server here using the needle HTTP client. Okay, so I'm gonna look over just to review a little bit. Okay, so so now so basically, like I said, the bearer token is hidden. So the bearer token is hidden in the env folder, and we're interacting with our own server. So in other words, someone can't just look at something that we have on the client. Like if we had some client-side JavaScript, they can't see our token. Okay. So the bearer token is stored on the server side and not the client side. So it cannot be stolen, cannot be used. Okay, so let's go to the next step, and that is to deploy this to Heroku. Again, if you have any questions, just let me know. There could be some stuff I missed. This is fairly new to me, but I understand it. I understand how it works, but maybe someone else can articulate it better than I can, or make any corrections. I'm definitely open to critiques and criticism, because that's only going to make me a better programmer. But hopefully this makes sense to you. So let's go and let's try to deploy this to Heroku. If there's anything I missed too, I probably will put it in the description if there's something I didn't touch on. I guess we have our git ignore, of course, because we don't want to. We're gonna do that to deploy in a minute, but we don't want any of the modules or anything like that in our repository. We definitely don't want our environmental variables with our token up there, so people can steal it. Let's see what else. I guess that's it. Here's the description of how to use this application. So anyway, let's go and let's deploy this to Heroku, and we'll make it live. Now that we have the program working in development, we want to get it to production. So we want to deploy the program. And one way to do that is by using the website Heroku. But before we get to that, we want to make sure that we have in our git ignore file, we have the node modules in the env file, because we don't want people to look into our repository and see our API key. So we also have a README file which will show the user how to use this application once they download it. So Heroku, this way, all you got to go is go to Heroku.com. So once you get to Heroku.com, you got to sign in. I'm already signed in. And you'll have a dashboard with, if you have any applications already, you'll see some applications. If not, then obviously you won't see any. So the first thing we want to do here, go back to our terminal, is we want to make sure, first of all, that we have the Heroku CLI. So the command line interface, I think is what it stands for. So you can do a search for that, and you'll probably find it first in your search. And you can install it in different ways. The different ways will show. I think Homebrew is one way to do it. And let's see here. I think they have Homebrew. Yeah, that's one of the easiest ways to do it. But they'll show you different ways that you can install the Heroku CLI. So once you got that installed, the first thing you want to do is sign into Heroku. Okay, so Heroku login. Right. And it'll pop up in your browser. Just put any key. I think it's going to pop up on my other browser here. But just, you'll see a button. It'll say login, so just go ahead and log in. So it's already logged in. Excellent. Okay, so then the next step, let me get over here. Okay, so now what you want to do is you want to create your app. So you can name it anything you want. I'm going to name mine Yelp API node proxy. So this should create the application, and it will show up on Heroku. So Yelp API node proxy is creating the application. So now when we go to our dashboard, refresh this. It's probably going to be on the other page. Yeah, here it is right here. So Yelp API proxy. Now, if you try to open this, it's just going to show, okay, welcome to your app, because there's nothing loaded on there. So now what you want to do is do a git. So you want to initiate a git repository in your directory. That. So now we have this, and I can do a git status, and it'll show these are all the things that are staged, or I guess they're not even staged yet. They're waiting to be added. So what you want to do first of all is make sure that you're not adding anything you don't want to. It looks like we're good here. So I'm going to do a git. Make sure this is a git add and dot period. That means you're adding everything essentially. Okay. Then if I do a git status, you'll see all the stage files. And so now what you want to do is do a git commit. And they say to do AM. So that's what they're saying on Heroku. So you do that, and then you just say initial commit, something like that. Okay, so you got git commit, initial commit, and go and commit it. Do another git status, and then you'll notice there's nothing to be committed. Everything is, the working tree is clean. Okay, so now what you want to do is go back here, and you'll notice if you go to deploy that there's going to be this right here. Now don't copy the $, just copy that right there. And this will add, you're going to add that remote repository. Okay, so you're adding that branch essentially. This. So Heroku git remote, so you're actually adding the remote repository in this instance, and it should be on the master branch. Okay, so we'll do that. Awesome. Now what we're going to do is git push Heroku master. So this is going to push the entire app onto Heroku. And you'll see that it'll show building. It should say building succeeded, hopefully. All right, now we're gonna go back, and let's go back to, let's first of all go to our app. We'll notice that the app is there, but it's not gonna work because we need to add the E and V variables. So let's see, hopefully it'll, yeah, so you'll see that the data is not being loaded onto the document object model. So it's not going to the dump, so what do we need to do? We're gonna go back over to our environment variables that we have. So these guys. And so we notice we have an API underscore base underscore URL. Okay. Let's just copy that. And I think you can copy the entire thing. Actually, oops. Let's not, let's just copy without the quotation marks. Okay. Pardon me. All right, so let's go here. I'm gonna go here. Now let's go to settings. And let's go to reveal config bars. API base URL. Now let's put in, that's the base URL. So we're gonna add that first, right? And then we've got to add the API key value. So let's copy this whole key so we can get that whole key in there. All right. API key value. All right, and let's add that. Now let's go back to the application. I'll just do a refresh, and it should possibly work. Start refreshing. There it is. There's the data. And let's make sure it works. Goes through all the review previews. Let's check the console just to make sure there's no errors. There might be some sort of... No, doesn't look like there's any errors. So it looks like we're good to go. This concludes the video about using a proxy server to make API calls. In our case, using the Yelp Fusion API. Please be sure to like and subscribe and possibly comment. That's it for this lesson, and remember, just be well, and always be coding. This is Brian Kidd, the Holistic Programmer, signing off.
Thank you for watching another edition of The Holistic Programmer. For more details, please see video information. Please support by pressing the like button.